Who are you? Delta again. I was just up here shooting stills of this cloud. It had a trail come on through this, and there was a spot where the trail had narrowed, but since we'd seen these waves come off, and then I just heard the rumble of this plane that's come on through. And we just have this massive storm coming in from the east. It is curling underneath the subtropical ridge of the Bermuda High, which typically is in place out over the Atlantic and pressing into the southeastern U.S. A part of it has bubbled off and is over the Great Lakes states, inducing a very, very hot scenario for the northeastern and eastern U.S. But in the meanwhile, this low pressure has essentially pinwheeled out west, kind of a backwards moving storm. I mean, for the meteorological conditions, it's perfectly natural, but the whole scenario, the whole setup, the whole contortedness of the jet stream is what is unusual. And so what I have here today is moisture coming over the Colorado Rockies. The moisture coming in, streaming in from the Gulf of Mexico over these mountains. I am on the leeward side, so I'm not getting any of the orographics. I'm not getting any of the orographic, the uplift that can really extract quite a bit of moisture from a saturated atmosphere were it to run into a mountain range. I'm on the dry side of that as the storm is coming over this way. So we'll do a little map analysis and check things out. An interesting piece of news come across my desk where apparently some papers, I don't know if this is true or not, that Edward Snowden released, and there is the name of the chemtrail program, that it began in the 60s. It is to combat global climate change. And apparently the belief is now that if it stops, that the planet's weather, and particularly the American weather, will descend into chaos inside of 1 year. We'll end up with a famine and we'll empty the cities, and then we have a reason why Homeland Security has bought 1 billion plus bullets. People will be hungry. They have nothing stored up. They have no savings. They have no job. And this country's soils and water are contaminated. A famine is coming. And that's what all the preparation has been about. So when we stop seeing these chemtrail planes, according to this material, then climate chaos will ensue shortly thereafter. All right, be back in a sec. Some nice big waves rolling across the sky as this monster backward moving storm begins to move on through. With the rains off to the west, kind of in amongst some trees, but the main core of the low will be passing just to our south later on tonight and tomorrow. And here's just some of those waves that now bring us the weather. Hey everybody, just want to check in on the map analysis, and there's kind of some interesting things going on across the country. I led off and talked about this major low pressure system that is migrating and has migrated. In fact, it disconnected from the jet stream up over eastern Canada, east of Maine. And we're looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor page right now because this is relevant to what's happening. But this low disconnected off and then migrated across the Appalachia, across the Ohio Valley, Missouri, Oklahoma today, and then it will continue into the heart of the desert Southwest. This is a very, very unusual scenario because usually what happens is we have a strong high pressure system, the Bermuda High, the one responsible for driving tropical waves from Africa, the Cape Verde Islands, and then into the Caribbean, and then up the gut of the United States or Mexico, delivering these hurricane storms. But what's happened is this Bermuda High was very late in developing this year, and for a while, a mirror or some aspect of it was farther to the north, and that helped, well, let's just say, shape the jet stream or contort it to a position that would allow for this cutoff or this disconnect, this chunk of energy to come off the jet stream that was pushing to the east to drop to the south and then begin to get caught and migrate in the mid-levels to the west, which is very tropical in nature. This is fascinating because this is heading right into the heart of where the drought in the United States has been for years on end. And this is without question an engineered event, or I wouldn't be talking about it. But already the drought, because of the last two systems, has really been eroded in Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and then a big portion of the middle of the nation. And this storm is so unusual. It's so unusual. that, it's just hard not to talk about. All right, so let's start with the drought. Let's go to the surface map, and that was the 21Z. I popped by that rather quickly, 21Z. So essentially Monday, early evening or late afternoon, 15 July, and high pressure. Essentially, this storm is here. It's churning. It's spinning. Here's a satellite of it right here. You can see it across Oklahoma now as we move into Monday evening into the Texas Panhandle. So the analysis this morning was that it was over the Red River Valley of North Texas, Oklahoma. Now it's moved into here, so it continues this westward trek. For reference, am about right here in the San Luis Valley of southern Colorado. So this storm is circulating like this. Here's the monster high pressure that will probably break record highs. Although climatologically at these latitudes, we are very near, if not on top of, the hottest 10 days or 2 to 3 weeks, of the year. So this is typical. This is when, if we're going to have a heat wave, we should have a heat wave. Although this deep low in the far northwest of Hudson Bay is anomalously deep for this time of year, there's another low. In fact, this one, as we're going to learn, may have a similar fate as this storm, as it was up here, got looped under the high, and then driven to the west. This one, big monster high developing, coming up over the ridge in Alaska. It almost looks like it's going to get pinched off and follow a similar fate. In fact, it might even get tucked underneath this big ridge. Essentially, the ridge is all the way through here with a weakness in the western states and hence some cooler weather and some cloudier conditions. But over the next day or so, this low will trek into New Mexico. This one comes off the California coast. This new one begins to slide off the Pacific coast. Here's the weakening storm as we get to Wednesday morning, the 12th. Monster high pressure, so some incredible heat continues across the Ohio Valley, Great Lakes, New England, and essentially the eastern United States. Maybe weak low, transiting the Atlantic, may spin up, may not. Nope, looks like it weakens out. But either way, as we get to 12th Thursday morning the 18th, this ridge has got this country covered with an enhanced monsoon across the Sierra Madre of Mexico and into the desert southwest as this inverted trough continues to work towards the Pacific. Curious thought. What if this energy, having originated into the jet stream, dropping over the Gulf Stream, but probably not having much of an impact on it since it was in the mid-levels, and then driven west underneath this high pressure, what if this then emerges into the Pacific, continues south, and then becomes a tropical element of some kind? I wonder if that would be a first. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, this low deepening, the ridge is sharpening up here in Alaska, as the jet stream is where it should be this time of year, up over Canada, with very weak flow across the United States. That is normal. This is far more typical of what the weather map should look like this time of year. Although this low with a 537.70 meter height line across the Hudson Bay is a bit deep, but weather's weird right now. This low continues to strengthen out in the Pacific. Oh, look at this. They've got a strong ridge, 591 in the Gulf of Alaska in the North Pacific, and then we're deepening to a 560 something low. This is odd. This low is almost identical to this one. So what I wonder, are they chemtrailing it? This is unusual. This is unusual. I wonder if they have their hands on this event. So the low begins to migrate out of our view, or at least the field of this map, by Sunday morning. Fairly typical, flat jet stream flow across the U.S., but this across Baja, Mexico, emerging into or lowering latitudes into the tropical Pacific. This might be spun up. That's something we need to look at. Okay, there's the low. Monsoons in place. The places we showed you on the U.S. drought monitor. There's the dry locations, and so we're getting some rain. That's really good. Here's a closed low sitting off in California. What I often see as this begins to develop will be chemtrails. And in fact, if I look very closely, and it will likely not survive compression, would be chemtrails on this far western edge. This little sliver of moisture. They always begin to like to work in the subtle areas, where dry air, depicted by the bright orange, begins to interface with the fields of moisture, with the first tendrils, the first crystals, the first molecules of water as they begin to come ashore. So let's take a look at the radar. There's the rains migrating through. Again, these are locations that have been so dry for so long. Pretty much anything west of the Missouri and then down into East Texas, Louisiana. West of there is dry, and these rains are incredibly welcome. And this is such an anomalous storm to bring such a gift. It's a little bit odd. Up close in the visible imagery, as you have seen, as I've shown you many times before, here's the storm here, and then here's the monsoon moisture being all excited, and then ship trails out of the Pacific. We're familiar with chemtrails in the sky being used as surveillance for what the different layers of the atmosphere are doing, how they undulate up and down. These chemtrails give these actions, these wave actions in the atmosphere, a visible reflection. They reflect them back so you can see how the atmosphere works, and that's very important to these weather makers. And they do the same to the maritime layer in the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans as well. So people mislabel these as chemtrails, but when you look much more closely, they are patterned, and there are energetic holes that are coursing across the oceans that these lines have a relationship to. We've got holes up in here, and then we have a pair of parallel lines. We've got a cross, and on some days you can see dozens, if not hundreds, of these ship trails out there. And it's interesting where they do intersect. The trail is usually deforming or misshapen in some way. In any case, here's the low back in western Oklahoma with some nice thunderstorms. Not a lot of rippling up in here, but we still find the geometry of two. Geometry of two. You will see, if you look, a series of patterns, all of these holes in here. And they all have some relationship, and they're usually similar in size, and they often run down the meridian of a cloud pattern. This one being here, and then the whole of the pattern run down the middle of it. Often happens. And holes all at regular measured intervals with connecting geometry. And you can see in the small ripples up in here, we have holes, where the holes appear the solid shield that is still contained with many gravity waves, then breaks apart. So these holes help establish a different resonant pattern as essentially the primary carrier wave is running through. Here's the San Luis Valley. I'm about right here, and holes in these thunderstorms. And once the holes start to show up, the clouds change to almost a hazy, diffuse look, and then a pattern or a rippled geometry begins to show up. And usually the holes are in the center of where the dissolution of the cloud happens. And again, they come in pairs. Pairs for the dissolution, and then pairs for the amplification, associated with these two cells. And as we get into tighter and tighter geometry, I mean, at a close-up scale, you can see some amazing things, and I would love to have a discussion with some of the astronauts aboard the space station, because they could spend enough time looking down at this planet from above in real time and in varying dimensions as the space station transits the planet. And so they get to see lots of cloud patterns in sunrise and sunset, where the patterning and the repetitions in the geometry and the right angles and the straight lines, all of those things that define intelligence show up. Any day, especially in the morning and the afternoon, and you'll see geometry. All right, out to the Pacific. This is that low. This is that low. The one, let's rewind, this puppy that develops into this storm that then slips underneath this ridge of high pressure. That is this guy right here. So we've identified that this guy is very similar to the storm that is now moving through the western U.S. or entering the western U.S. But what's fascinating is the cloud field behind it, and how many thousands of chemtrails this part of the atmosphere is enduring tonight, and has for a couple of days, is that as they run these straight lines across these regions in the atmosphere where there's great shearing, meaning change of speed and direction over distance. Great shearing. And so these straight lines laid out from Nome, Alaska into the Arctic, all the way out of the Pacific, with planes that look like commercial airliners. And at these latitudes, they can get away with more military flights because those persons up there almost expected because of the Cold War. But some days you see the planes, and this is what's happening above. And then there are many days where there's nothing because they're working somewhere else. And they only work with high priority items. There's some other bursts of trails down in there. Again, where we have locations of high shear in the atmosphere. Great change in direction and speed over short distances. And that would be at the edges where these lows are curling off, or where the peak of the ridge right in here ahead of it peaks and then begins to descend into the next trough of low pressure. And these are prime locations for them to draw their lines, for these architects to sketch out the sky, to see how these moving layers of the atmosphere respond. So the data from what the atmosphere is doing can go back into computers. The computer spits out a forecast, spits out a solution that conforms to what the weather makers desire, and then they make it so. What I don't know is how much of it is automated. How many drones are there? And who's provided the computing power? Nevertheless, the low that is now moving through the western states, this pattern is being duplicated right now. And there's our pair of lows, our pair of eyes. Let's go to the infrared. Let's have a look at that. There they are, little stripes. They're not cirrus clouds either, because I get too many. There's too much confusion about whether they're cirrus clouds. And see, when you begin to, you can see it out in here, but so often when you add this other coloring, it just, the brain loses it. The ZA curve is pretty good. If we slow it down. Nah, I think the water vapor is the best. You can see all of this incredible amount of trails. But in the vapor, you see the circulation. With this, we're only seeing clouds. We're seeing a temperature scale. See, it's smooth. It's smooth. And since we know these trails have an affinity for water, they're going to show up. All right, let's see how this puppy develops. Good night, everybody.